It's the final week of the month. You know what that means. It's style study time. And out of the 80 or so style studies we've done so far, there's only two others that are like this one, so listen up. Today we are diving into the classical impressionistic portraits of Edwardian era artist and absolute legend, John Singer Sargent. And there is a specific reason I've chosen Sargent for this month, so we'll get to that in a bit. Sargent's work in particular is still very relevant to even digital artists in this day and age. There is just something so magical about the way that he painted portraits that even to this day, very few of us can actually hold a candle to. I'm really excited to dive in already, but if this is your very first style study, hi, welcome! My name is Srish and I'm so glad you're here because today we're going to level up your art by like 1,000,000%. Style Study is a regular series we do here on my channel where we take a look at some of our favorite artists, analyze their work and see what we can learn from it. Keyword, learn. We're not here to plagiarize anyone's work or copy their style. We're simply here to learn some really cool art tips and tricks and see how we can apply them to finding our own unique art style. I usually structure my style studies in 3 parts. In part 1, we'll take a look at Sargent's work, analyze his style and see what we can learn from it. Part 2 will be a study of one of his original paintings. The beautiful reference I've chosen today is this one. And in part 3, we'll apply everything that we learned today to an original painting of our own. And this one has a bit of a twist to it. If you enjoyed this video and learned something today, please do let me know by giving it a big thumbs up and subscribing to my channel. Comment below your biggest takeaway from this study and come say hello on socials. All my links are in the description. Alrighty, if you're ready, grab a snack, sit back, and let's dive into another style study featuring John Singer Sargent. John Singer Sargent was an Edwardian-era painter who lived and worked between the late 1850s and the early 1920s. Though his parents were American, he was born and raised in Italy, but lived and worked across Europe through his career. Though the era of art at the time leaned towards Impressionism, Sargent mostly painted elements of realism within the Impressionistic paradigm, which makes his work very interesting and unique. In fact, he was often referred to as the best portrait painter of his era. His education was actually really progressive for the time, in that while most artists of the time did the whole sketch, underpainting, layers and layers of art in order to get super refined rendering, his most influential educator, Emile Auguste Carolus Duran, I butchered that, I know, but they encouraged an Alla Prima approach. This is more about going right in and painting the colors and values you see straight up without going through the motions of layers upon layers of refinement. As a result, Sargent's work was a lot more dynamic, textured, and alive. He really succeeded in capturing mood and personality in his portraits, as opposed to focusing on ornate and super accurate visual details. Though his usual subjects were aristocrats and high society folks, there's a funny story about one of his paintings that makes me laugh every time. There was this one full-body portrait that he did of this lady called Madame Gautreau, or Madame X, and when he exhibited it in Paris, it caused a huge scandal, like to the point where he decided to just move to England and start a new life there. You guys want to see what this insane, scandalous painting was? Here. Yeah, that's how long ago this man lived. This was considered extremely provocative at the time. Sargent also never married. He was a bachelor all his life. More recently though, it is speculated that he might have in fact been gay and that his homosexuality had a lot to do with his work. This is primarily why I chose Sargent to close out Pride Month. His art innately challenged the expectations and norms of society at the time, and that is exactly what the Pride movement is all about. Here's another interesting story about him. Apparently, King Edward VII recommended Sargent for a knighthood, but the guy fully just said, nope, no thank you, just straight up turned down a knighthood. That's just the kind of guy John was. He was just a controversial list. Speaking of lists, here are 5 key characteristics to Sargent's art. Like I said earlier, Sargent's work is an interesting mix of Impressionism and Realism, but there's actually a very specific structure that he followed when it came to rendering his portraits, because all the realism was pretty much entirely concentrated on areas of exposed skin. So if we zoom into this piece here, we see that there is a lot of refined rendering in the features of the face and neck, but also down her upper back and arms. But then we look at her hair and clothing, those have much rougher, much more impressionistic brushwork. Same here, see the realistic definition in her face, her hands, even down to her wrists and elbows? Now compare that to things like the fabric, or even the keys on the organ behind her, or the details in the wall. Those are all impressionistic in that they kind of indicate what those objects and textures should look like at a quick glance, but you don't really see a lot of realistic detail like you do in the skin. Like, look at this painting he did of Teddy Roosevelt. See how there is all this super detailed shading in the face and the hand, but the rest of it is only given enough detail to indicate what the shape and surface are supposed to be, rather than painting every nuance and texture. What this does is essentially drive focus to the face, because it almost simulates how we take in information from the world around us. So imagine you're walking into a room to grab your phone that's on a table. You're very much aware of all the other stuff in the room, what the floors and walls look like, but your focus is entirely on finding that phone. So you're really only looking at the table. What Sargent did was essentially reverse engineer that feeling by getting rid of details in anything that wasn't super important to the scene, so that your focus is driven to the bits that do have lots of detail, i.e. the face. Or just anything that displays the essence of the character really. Like in that Roosevelt portrait, it wasn't just his face that was in focus, but also his right hand, which is usually symbolic of power, leadership, and doing good for the world. Everything else is there to give you context, but it doesn't serve to tell you of his role in that scene, so it doesn't have to have much detail. In this piece here, of course you have the details in her face, torso, and hand, but there's very specific other accessories that are given a lot of rendering, like the necklace around her throat, the silk bow in her hair, and to some extent the gold details of her armchair. This woman isn't just known for her beauty, but also her opulence. So it's not just a random mix of arbitrarily painting some areas realistic and others impressionistic. Sargent thought very carefully about the story and the essence of his subjects as he chose which areas of his portraits to refine. Just like with the refinement and impressionism, Sargent also planned out his values carefully in order to tell specific stories. So for the most part, portraits had this dramatic lighting that really caught your eye from a distance. But what's interesting is that female or feminine subjects and children often stood out from a dark, shadowy background more than male or masculine subjects did. It was like that trope of softer characters being the light on a dark day, while harsher characters were all broody and dramatic. And for the most part, the backgrounds were darker than the character, and it provided a nice contrast, seeing as most of his subjects were, well, Caucasian. So the pale skin stands out in stark contrast against the shadowy background, giving us some very good readability. Plus, women and children are often seen wearing paler clothes to really enhance that contrast, and sometimes if a woman is seen in a darker dress that blends into the background, it almost creates a more sultry, provocative feeling. Another interesting detail is that if a character has dark hair, it is often just painted a flat, shadowy tone, maybe with like curly edges. Like here, you see how there's just no detail within the body of the hair? The only reason you can tell it is hair is because the edges have so much curl texture. But the fact that all that black is left untextured means it is really able to stand stark and loud against the paler skin, further enhancing the contrast and driving focus to the face. But it's not like paler hair has much more detail. It is very, very impressionistic. In fact, studying the way he painted hair alone is excellent practice for brush economy. Let's look at the shadows of the face though, because here's what's interesting. The faces are almost always lit from one side, but it's not super dramatic like how Rembrandt painted. This light source is a lot larger and illuminates a lot of the face. The core shadow usually only spans one side of the face, only the planes that face directly away from the light. However, there is also a really beautiful, soft transition into the shadow that creates this gorgeous roundness in the cheek, as well as a rounded folding away at the brow bone and temple. That said though, there are also shadows in the eye socket and around the nose bridge and bulb. These tend to be smaller, tighter edged, and often deeper with more saturation. These shadows give us definition in the facial features, which can sometimes be lost when we paint soft, supple skin. So again, it's a lot of interplay between light and dark, soft and harsh, defined and abstract. It's like Sargent was a mixologist, but with color and light. Speaking of colors, Sargent often used a palette that was surprisingly warm, and that it was warm in surprising places. In the skin of the face, for instance, the midtones are actually fairly cool toned. So while the highlights and shadows are rather warm and yellow shifted, the midtones veer towards pink a lot more. Now, obviously the terms highlights, midtones and shadows are relative because what counts as a shadow in one area might be a midtone in another. But look at this face, for instance. In the lighter half, these midtone areas around her cheek and jaw seem to be tinted a lot more pink, whereas in these shadowy areas of the nose and the inner apple of the cheek, it's more yellow-orange shifted. But in the shadowy half, the temperature shifts are the same, it's just darker values. So the midtones in the apple of the cheek are still a lot pinker, while the shadows just behind the nose are yellowy and orangey. An extra little detail is that the brighter specular highlights tend to also be really cool toned and pink or lavender. So it's like these alternating layers of warm shadow, cool midtone, warm highlight, and cool specular highlight. But these shifts are so subtle and sometimes low saturation that you'll barely notice the shift in color temperature unless you're actively looking for it. It's like he added a subtle balance through a plethora of hues, but all you see as a viewer is the sum total. Let's look a little deeper at the color placements. In pretty much every portrait, Sargent painted these deep, warm shadows around the eye sockets. It's like here in this little girl's face, see the oranges around the eyes? You also see it here in his own self-portrait. There's a very, very warm orange in the inner eye socket. It's such an interesting detail because it makes the eyes look so alive, like there's a lot of blood under the skin surface, but without making it look like dark circles. However, the areas of the nose bulb and the apples of the cheek are usually very pink, much cooler toned. And I don't think this difference in tone is purely visual. I actually think this goes back to the layering that we looked at. The cheeks are often rounded and jut out towards you, and so they're bound to be brighter, while the eye socket is recessed into the head and tends to be deeper and more shadowy. However, using very deep, dark shadow tones might end up making the eye look tired and bruised. So in really saturating that orange in the eye socket, it's like Sargent makes them appear deeper and more profound without making them too tired and shadowy. The body is often painted to be a lot more yellowy, likely to, again, push focus to the face, where the colors are a lot more nuanced. The background and clothing and accessories in general tend to be true to color. Reflective surfaces like silk and metal tend to have more hue shifts. Matte surfaces like wood or velvet tend to have fewer. But the one common factor is almost always this incredibly deep, incredibly warm shadow in the background. It is usually a drop shadow caused by the subject themselves, and it serves to create one really dark section of the canvas, which balances out all the super bright tones in the rest of the composition. Plus, it's a really cool way to add a lot of drama to a painting without needing to add any more storytelling details. So we've spoken a lot about the more refined, realistic parts of Sargent's art. Now let's look at some of the finer details in the impressionistic areas. First off, the character is always in the foreground or midground, but there are pretty much never any objects in front of them. And I'm very much only talking about the portraits here. Every background element is either right next to them or behind them. And what's interesting is that this depth of field determines how much detail the elements get. Here's a great example. See how the chair she's sitting on has pretty much the same amount of detail as her clothes do? But then you look back at the piano behind her, and all those keys are basically just one long white shape. And further back, the flowers and the wall are even more abstract. Here, none of the elements are really right next to her. It all gets gradually more abstract as it recedes into the background, but I really wanted to draw your eye to the train of her dress here. See how the shapes get flatter and less nuanced as the train goes further back towards that table? The abstraction creates this almost field blur effect where it really narrows the focal point to only keep the character in focus. It's like Sargent's goal was to, again, reverse engineer that feeling of looking for something very specific, in this case the subject, and everything else is there for context clues, but doesn't necessarily demand your focus. Another interesting detail is that the jewelry is almost never rendered in full detail. I especially love this, okay? So look at this string of pearls. At first glance, it records as pearls, right? But watch what happens when we zoom in. Suddenly you realize it is really just a string of specular highlights for the most part, with only a small section that has truly defined beads. Look at the gold detail in this lady's dress here. So beautiful, translucent and detailed, but when you zoom in, it is literally just a few bright lines that create the impression of translucent fabric that catches the light in some areas. Sargent was all about saying more with less, and that, for me, is very much the biggest challenge with learning from impressionistic artists. Okay, let's talk about my favorite part of Sargent's work, and that's the more dynamic, abstract, almost spontaneous looking pieces. Like this painting he did of Monet himself painting. It feels like a moment in time captured on a canvas. Or this one with these two kids and their lanterns in a field of flowers. It isn't just that Sargent documented an event that occurred, it's like he was able to capture the very soul of that moment. I really love these pieces because they're not trying to push a narrative or show someone in a specific light like a lot of his portraits do, which makes sense. He was specifically commissioned to paint those people in a specific manner. But these pieces, these stories, they feel like little moments of time that he stole away and put onto a canvas. These paintings where everything blends into everything, where it's not characters that stand stark against the background, but living, breathing humans that coexist with the world around them. I feel like these are the pieces where you truly get to see the world through his eyes. There's a lot more freedom of brushwork, a looser rendering that doesn't necessarily follow a specific order or structure, but rather seeks to capture mood. It's not about the characters or the landscape or the objects in the scene. It's about how he felt in that moment. It feels like these were the paintings he did to feed his own soul. Like this piece, right? You see that all of it, the face, the clothing, the parasol, the background, it is all rendered with the same amount of impressionism. He didn't try to create varying depths of focus or separate her from the scene because she was part of the scene. Or here, he didn't try to create realism at any point in this piece. His focus was entirely on capturing the warmth of the day, the sand and the water creating a neutral backdrop for the super saturated scene going on in the center. And even then, the characters are all nondescript. It's not about who they are, it's about the atmosphere. Oh, you guys, this is the type of stuff that really scratches an itch in my brain. Because again, Sargent really was the king of doing more with less, of telling dramatic, elaborate stories with the most simplistic, intentional, and powerful brushwork. So, to sum up part 1 of this study, here are 5 key characteristics to John Singer Sargent's art. Number 1, Sargent used a very interesting balance of realism and impressionism in his work, where the face and skin of his subjects were painted in a detailed way and pretty much everything else was painted impressionistically. 2, there was a lot of drama through deep shadows in the background that really helped the paler skin of his subjects pop out. He also used form and occlusion shadows in the face to create dimension. 3, Sargent painted alternating warm and cool tones based on value, which allowed for beautiful, subtly balanced palettes. Number 4, little details like the definition versus abstraction of the background elements helped to create a narrow focal point, allowing the viewer to automatically focus on the character while subconsciously using the background for context clues. And number 5, Sargent's more dynamic, complex pieces focus more on capturing scenes through mood and composition, as opposed to focusing in on characters and their appearances. And these are my personal favorite ones of all of his work. For our study today, this is the reference that I picked. It is a portrait Sargent did of Gabrielle Fauré around 1889. I picked this one because it is simple enough that I could achieve some form of likeness, but also contains a lot of the signature details Sargent painted in most of his portraits. Now, although we know Sargent liked to paint alla prima, which would mean just going straight in with the colors, I wasn't quite confident in my abilities yet, so I decided to start how I always do, with a sketch. Look, you gotta do what you gotta do to beat blank canvas syndrome, okay? I then lowered the opacity and did another refined sketch on a new layer. We're aiming for some likeness at this stage, but it doesn't have to be exact, because guess what? We're gonna paint over all of it anyway. None of these lines are going to be visible, so as long as they're a vague guide for the placement of our colors, that's good enough for us. Next, I established a palette to color pick from. I didn't realize until this point just how limited the color palette is for this piece. It's a lot of variants of orange and yellow. You have deeper warm browns and some desaturated yellowy grey greens. I started by roughing in the background. I always start with this for most studies because it helps establish a value scale, but this is especially helpful with a piece that was painted indoors in natural light or with the use of old-timey lamps. You don't really get extreme overexposed highlights in these scenarios, so establishing the background here, which was mostly made of dark midtones and some shadows, reminded me to control the brighter values. I then blocked the big elements on their own layer. This allows me to lock transparency and paint within the lines. Obviously, that's not how a traditional piece is painted, but I was really happy with the sketch here, and because we're aiming for likeness from this point forward, having flats just really makes the process more efficient. We'll have a more traditional approach with the original painting that's coming up in a bit, but for now, I blocked in the midtones as flat layers for the skin, hair, and outfit. Alright, let's render. I started with the shadow around the eye because it is the microcosm to the macrocosm that is rest of the face. The values and hues I use in this small area pretty much cover most of the colors in the rest of the face. So once I established this little bit, I just get to color pick from here and paint the rest of it. Like we saw in part 1, the cheeks are much more pink, the jaws and temples more orange. There's also a very desaturated shadow under the jaw and under the nose bowl, but these are small and aren't too dark or harsh. The high points of the face are really yellow, but because they are so pale, you don't quite clock it as being too much warmer than the oranges or pinks in the cheek and eye socket. Also, can I just say, I really love how that nose turned out. All those subtle value shifts really create that molded, rounded form. It's so beautiful. The hair, on the other hand, was tricky because what I basically had to do was do an impression of an impression. Sargent didn't paint section or strand detail in the hair. He painted an abstract idea of what the hair felt like. So when trying to replicate those shapes, I really just had to put my pattern finding mind to the side and just try to copy what I saw without trying to apply logic or preconceived notions to it. That was hard. And now we refine. We no longer need the sketch, so I basically lowered the opacity and painted over it. Most of this stage centers around the face because, again, exposed skin was really the only place that got a realism treatment in Sargent's work. For this process, my brush size was much smaller, and I also pretty much just used my chalk brush for most of this painting in general. His brow was looking a little too angry, so I softened it out, and again, that nose was a 10 out of 10. Obviously, the likeness will never be 100% accurate, but it's always important to remember what our goal is with the study. We're trying to learn about color selection, value placement, contrast, and rendering skill. The likeness is a nice added bonus and looks nice on the video thumbnail, but my priority is always learning, especially when studying from a painting. That said, the inner corner of his eye was really hard to nail because there were so many implied forms and shadows as opposed to like hard edges and high contrast. The far eye was way more desaturated, probably to get it closer to the more grey tones of the background. It just really helps to create harmony between the subject and the background. I used a more bristly brush for the hair, but in this case the challenge was being able to control the shapes. If I was studying from life or from a photo and had the freedom to paint my own impression of his hair, I might have gone for a wetter brush that could drag colours around. I suspect that's what Sargent himself did because you see that nice flow of midtones being dragged into shadow. I was definitely surprised to see some blues in the hair. You don't even notice it until you zoom in because the warm tones so easily grab your attention. But it's that subtle blue that keeps the oranges in check. Painting the clothes should have been easy, but it was really hard to get the texture right. I suspect when Sargent painted those browns, he was using slightly more translucent, very wet paint, meaning in certain places the background tones creep in through the texture. The mustache had the same challenges as the hair in that there isn't a lot of strand detail to go off, and I was basically just copying the shapes as I saw them. Look, the bottom line is, this was a challenging study, especially with things like the suit jacket and the background, where a lot of the texture really came naturally as he used wet paint on heavy bristle brushes on textured canvas. Like, you really see the movement and can kind of imagine the direction and flow of his hand as he created these textures. With digital art, we don't get to have that, so we have to simulate it with textured brushes. Don't ask me how many I ended up using to create those yummy, crunchy background details. It was a lot. But it was worth it because I love how the study turned out. What do you think? Okay, this is where things get interesting. I kind of did a vague photo study, but not quite, because I also wanted to apply this style and use a lot of artistic license, especially with the impressionistic bits. As promised though, this time I didn't actually do a sketch, but rather went straight in with a giant brush and the main colors that I saw. I wanted to pick a reference that Sargent would have painted in his time in order to really cause a stir, but without losing his job. So I went with a reference that showed a very scandalous exposed shoulder and clearly demonic blue hair. Yeah, I can feel you clutching your pearls already. I say pearls, I mean string of specular highlights. Anyway, but with the large shapes in place, I kind of only used the reference photo as a vague guide from this point forward, but decided to rely more on Sargent's own portraits for guidance on color value, texture, and contrast. I actually used a very textured brush for pretty much this entire painting. It's one of the palette knife brushes from the Krita 4 default bundle, I believe. I really wanted to integrate that texture into the rendering right from the get-go. We're keeping the shadows really warm and going more pink with the midtones. The photo reference uses a much cooler light source, but I feel like that's a very modern thing to have light that bright that is also cool toned. You almost never see it in Sargent's work. He definitely had a thing for much warmer light. So that's kind of where I took this piece as well. I wasn't aiming for likeness at all, I just really wanted to focus on nailing the style. How do you take a very modern subject and try to preserve some of that modernness while also making it look like a traditional painting? Well, for one, you control the light source. Like we saw in the study, natural light on an indoor subject doesn't give you very bright, overexposed highlights on the skin, so you want to keep the value range tight. That blue light hitting her shoulder and collarbone is very much a modern twist, but I really like the idea of sort of merging worlds like that. So I kept it in, maybe mellowed it out a little, but I still kept it in. I definitely feel like this wasn't the best brush to use for her hair, ironically because it's a little too bristly. I used it to block the values in, but then I had to leave it alone for a bit so I could come back later and make it more impressionistic. Right now it looks a little too realistic with a lot of strand detail, and we really don't want that. I went in and darkened the shadows of her face as well, because who can resist a bit of extra drama, right? At this stage, I went in and started to almost unrefine the hair. So I grabbed the colors already in the hair, but flattened out a lot of the shapes, softening out the very textured edges and even blending some of the strands and sections into each other. And now it looks way more yummy and impressionistic. I also went in with some photo textures just to really emulate that traditional look. This canvas was too big for my textured brushes to create enough sharpness, so we had to use photo texture. But here's the finished piece. I love how it recontextualizes a modern portrait with some classical lighting and colors. And there we have it, John Singer Sargent demystified, a little bit. Man, it never occurred to me just how much warmth and just how much yellow was in his work until we did the original painting and a little bit in the study as well. I love the look though, I really do. I might bring it forward. But what was your biggest takeaway from this study? What was your favorite part of his work? Comment below and let me know. Pretty much all of Sargent's work is now on the common public forum. It's open, so I will leave a link to his Wikipedia in the description. And there is so much to learn. And honestly, you guys, I really want you to go ahead and try a study of your own. Like, I don't just want you to watch these videos. I really want you to try these styles out for yourself, because I promise you, nothing will help you improve your art quite as quickly as experimenting with a bunch of different styles. So please do it, and please let me know if you do. Of course, if you enjoyed this video and learned something today, let me know by giving it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, because I post new art content all the time. And if you like what I do and would like to support my work, you can do so by becoming a patron. All of my Patreon supporters get tons of rewards every single week, including my custom brush kit, all of my speed paints from start to finish, the step-by-step PDFs for all of my paintings from start to finish, as well as access to over 80 real-time paint-along art tutorials that do not go up on YouTube, but they're like an hour long each at least. So you're missing out if you're not a patron yet. I'll leave a link up here and in the description, and thank you so much for checking it out. Finally, are there any other artists you'd like a style study on in the future? First, check out my style study playlist. It will show up here in the outro in just a sec. I've done, like I said, over 80 of these, and chances are I've probably covered some of your faves on the series already. But if I haven't, feel free to request a style study in the comments below. Come tell me on socials or on my Discord server. Links to everything are in the description, and I'll be more than happy to add your artist to my ever-growing list. And that's about everything for this video, so thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I truly hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Check out some more style studies down here, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!